Have you ever noticed how few heroes there seem to be in our world these days, especially in the public sphere? And I'm not talking about characters in movies, but actual human beings. People whose courage and integrity are obvious and admirable, and whose presence in our world calls forth those same qualities in ourselves. Personally, I'm not seeing too much of that sort of thing in the political sphere, which to me seems a bit odd, considering the fact that we commonly regard political figures as our so-called leaders. Sure, there seem to be plenty of opportunists, panderers, and ideologues among them, but not too many genuinely heroic figures. And I'm not seeing too many in the domain of celebrity either, whose denizens are supposed to be our artistic and cultural leaders in some sense, but who rarely seem to rise to the level of even modest respectability. And so, to me, one of the unsettling oddities of our world these days is that the people we've accepted as our exemplars and leaders hardly ever seem to embody any heroic qualities. Sure, they may be good at singing or acting or playing basketball or at manipulating the levers of political power, but all of that's very different from actually being heroic. And so, in light of all of that, I'd like to explore the nature of heroism in our world these days, especially with respect to the Jungian hero archetype and the hero's journey. Basically, the question is, what can the hero archetype and the hero's journey offer today's world, where heroism seems so strangely elusive? And here I'd like to give a shout out to a viewer who goes by the name Benjamin Dover, but I believe his friends call him Ben, who requested more content about Jungian archetypes, after which a bunch of other viewers quickly agreed. So, tip of the invisible tam o'shanter to you, Ben Dover. Anyhow, before we get into the real meat of this video, we should probably start with a few preliminaries. But if you want to bypass that part, you can skip ahead to the timestamp I'll put at the bottom of your screen right about now. All right, first preliminary. What is a Jungian archetype? Well, I talked about that at some length in my last video, so I'll put a link to it in the description section of this video if you're not too familiar with that. Second, let's get a handle on a basic working definition of heroism, which Webster's tells us is, this is a little tautological actually, heroism is heroic conduct, especially as exhibited in fulfilling a high purpose or attaining a noble end. And heroic, in turn, is defined as of or relating to courageous people or the mythological or legendary figures of antiquity. So it seems like one of the key components of heroism is courage. So let's say a few things about that. The first of which would be that, somewhat contrary to popular wisdom, courage isn't actually defined by an absence of fear. After all, when you think about it, when we're unafraid of something dangerous, it can easily be the product of our ignorance or our sheer stupidity. You know, those times when we just don't have enough good sense to be afraid of something in the first place. But being ignorant or idiotic doesn't make us courageous, although it can certainly make us fearless. Instead, courage has to do with how we respond to our fears, with whether we run from them or whether we're able to face them and then move forward despite feeling afraid. In other words, the person who's simply unafraid for whatever reason has no opportunity to be courageous in the first place. Basically, without fear, there is no courage, and no courageous heroism either. Contrary to popular opinion, heroes know all too well what it is to be afraid of danger. They just don't let their fear stop them from fulfilling something that lies beyond it. And finally, I'd like to situate the hero archetype within the framework of something I mentioned briefly in my last video, which is the hero's journey, which in turn was popularized by Joseph Campbell, especially in his 1949 book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. I bet you might have heard of that. Basically, the hero's journey is an account of how heroes become heroic in the first place, how life sometimes manages to turn regular everyday people like ourselves into actual heroes. Joseph Campbell articulates 17 different thematic parts to that process. However, for the purposes of this video, I'd like to refer only to the ones I think are particularly relevant to today's world. So perhaps the first thing to note about the hero's journey would be that it involves descending into difficult and harrowing circumstances, and sometimes even into the underworld itself. Basically, a kind of bottoming out experience that brings about a fundamental metamorphosis in our character, in who and what we are in this world. That's because we hardly ever become heroic while we're just lounging around in our comfort zones and safe spaces. Instead, heroism is forged in the crucible of our hopelessness and desperation in the face of danger, in the raging furnace of imminent annihilation, and in the firestorm of everything in this world we don't want to experience, but where life, in her inscrutable wisdom, ends up taking us anyhow. It's born in those times when we're brought to our outermost limits, and we probably just want to give up, but something deep inside of us keeps us moving forward. And at this point, we should probably also note that, as in the case of pretty much every other great and worthwhile thing in this world, the muse of our greater heroism exacts her price. And there's really only one currency she accepts in payment. And that currency is our own blood and our own courage. But thing is, here we're already at odds with a lot of our world's prevailing habits and values, at least in the United States where I live. From that perspective, life is mostly about being comfortable and getting what we want. You know, about wearing the right clothes, owning the right cell phone, driving the right car. Not about experiencing a difficult metamorphosis into a heroic being. In essence, the first reason why our world needs the hero archetype is that it offers us a much more elevated way of seeing life, a deeper set of values, and ultimately a better paradigm for our lives themselves. One that's governed by actualizing what's powerful within our souls, rather than distracting ourselves with an unending stream of trivialities. In essence, our world needs the hero archetype because it helps us raise our sights a little higher than we probably would otherwise. But beyond that, the hero archetype invites us to adopt a very different stance toward life's inevitable hardship and suffering. From that perspective, the painful, challenging side of things isn't something we should be constantly trying to escape. Sometimes we need to live through it and learn from the difficulties we're experiencing in order to become a little more heroic ourselves. Consequently, the hero archetype teaches us to appreciate and honor the moments that temper the steel in our souls. And when we're able to do that, all of a sudden, what seems at first like idiotic, senseless suffering in our lives starts to become a lot more meaningful and significant, which in turn also makes it a lot easier to endure. So I'd say that the second reason why our world needs the hero's archetype is that it teaches us to honor our suffering as something worthwhile, as a necessary passage, and as something with a positive, constructive potential for our lives. But of course, learning those sorts of lessons is a considerable challenge in a world like ours. But why? What makes it so difficult to orient ourselves toward actualizing our heroic potential and to honor our suffering as a necessary and integral part of that process? Well, I'd say that a big part of the problem has to do with how we've lost our sense for what genuine heroism is in the first place. For instance, consider the so-called Mary Sue phenomenon in today's filmmaking, which, by the way, occurs with both male and female characters. It's just that these days, Hollywood has proven itself particularly inept at depicting genuinely heroic female characters, which, of course, is blatantly unfair and discriminatory to women. Oops, but I digress. Anyhow, for those of us who don't know what Mary Sues are, well, they're characters who are meant to seem heroic, but who never have to make any sort of transformative hero's journey into the underworld. Who never have to confront and overcome any of their own weaknesses, fears, and doubts. Instead, Mary Sues are portrayed as fully evolved demigods, already far more powerful, capable, clever, perceptive, astute, and morally correct than anyone else. And so, they simply assume the mantle of heroism without any further ado, and then proceed to mow down all of their adversaries as if it were a fait accompli. But the problem is that while that may be the logic of gods and demigods, it's not the logic of actual human heroism. There's nothing heroic or inspiring about characters, male or female, who automatically win every contest without any struggle or doubt, and who gleefully don the mantle of heroism without any real sacrifice. Instead, as we've already noted, the hero's journey is about our capacity to live through hardship and defeat, and to be transformed by it into something greater. To rise like a phoenix from the ashes of our annihilation, and eventually to become more heroic ourselves as a result. And so I'd say that the third reason why our world needs the hero archetype would have to do with how it can help us recover a more realistic sense for what heroism is in the first place, and at the same time help us reclaim a correspondingly more realistic sense of our own heroic possibilities in life. But beyond that, I'd say that a fourth reason has to do with what Carlos Castaneda calls a worthy opponent, which is someone or something powerful enough and dangerous enough to pull us beyond ourselves. A nemesis whose ability rivals or exceeds our own. And side note, that's another reason why Mary Sues aren't genuine heroes. It's because worthy opponents don't exist for them, especially since there aren't any foes or forces realistically capable of defeating them. But once again, I digress. Maybe I should stop doing that. Anyhow, unless you're an omnipotent Mary Sue, facing a worthy adversary is almost always a very intimidating prospect, and not one we're inclined to undergo willingly. And here we find another important characteristic of the hero's journey, that of our resistance to fulfilling our greater heroic potentials in life. The truth is that most of us do not go gentle into that good night. In fact, we pretty much have to be dragged, kicking and screaming toward our greater destinies in life. It's a little like what the humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow calls the Jonah complex, which has to do with how we actively resist and sabotage our own self-actualization. And the name Jonah is, of course, a reference to the biblical Jonah, who tried to squirm out of his greater destiny to prophesy the destruction of Nineveh as commanded by God. Don't know if you remember that. But which only presaged his chthonic descent into the belly of a whale until he eventually reached his own moment of transformation. But the point is that one reason why heroism is so rare in our world is that most of the time we're actively resisting it. And so a fourth reason why our world needs the hero archetype has to do with how it can help us become aware of that resistance, which in turn can help us become free enough in life to decide to do otherwise, to choose to face our fears and then overcome them. Basically, the hero archetype can show us that it's entirely feasible to lay claim to a much broader range of freedom and personal power than we ever imagined possible. Okay, but now maybe you're wondering about why we'd ever resist our potential for heroism in the first place. Well, it turns out that there are actually several good reasons for that. First, as Stan Lee of Spider-Man fame once said, with great power comes great responsibility. Have to lower your voice to say that. And that would include the power inherent in becoming heroic. So, we resist the hero's journey partly because it involves assuming responsibility for whatever might result from it. And the truth is that most of us don't particularly like having to be responsible for ourselves. Sure, it definitely has its pleasures, but those pleasures belong to our higher nature, the kinds of fulfillment that accrue from living toward the depth of what we can possibly be. But all of that doesn't necessarily satisfy the more childish part of what we are, the part that actually likes to feel helpless and therefore incapable of assuming responsibility for our lives. Basically, it's always a seductive thing to see ourselves as victims rather than as responsible, potentially heroic figures. And that's partly because responsibility actually does make demands on us. And in fact, it can very easily feel like a kind of burden. And so the more juvenile and self-indulgent side of what we are resists the idea of developing enough strength to bear it. Basically, part of us would rather stay weak, oppressed, and irresponsible rather than become strong, liberated, and responsible. Sure, it may not be the most elevated or noble part of our nature, but it's there nonetheless. And I'd say that it's very easy to observe it in our world these days. Just try turning on the news for a few minutes if you're not convinced. And so I'd say that the fifth reason why our world needs the hero archetype would have to do with how it calls us toward assuming responsibility for ourselves and for the quality of our lives. And it helps us become strong enough to carry the weight of that responsibility too. But beyond that, we resist the call of the hero's journey because of how it might transform us, even if we know that those changes will ultimately prove to be positive. Part of that's due to a fairly deep and primitive fear most of us have. What if at some point in our lives we change so profoundly and so thoroughly that our friends and loved ones can no longer relate to us or understand us, or maybe even they reject us? It's a pretty scary prospect. Of course, on the other hand, if the price of those relationships is that we never change and grow as human beings, if our friends demand that we have to remain the same as we've always been, well, at some point we can wonder whether those people are really our friends in the first place. Because when you think about it, isn't that exactly what our enemies would want? For us to remain forever small and unfulfilled, especially with regard to our capacity for heroism. But, of course, that realization doesn't necessarily make transforming our lives any less scary. And so I'd say that the sixth reason why our world needs the hero archetype involves learning to be authentic. That is, learning to be who and what we really are, and to live toward what we possibly can be in this world, and not remaining the obedient slaves of other people's desires and expectations. And finally, we resist the hero's journey because it's not necessarily an easy thing to look into the powerful vortex of what we are beneath all of our layers of predictability and superficiality. In fact, it can be very overwhelming, like it's way more than we can possibly handle. That's because underneath everything else we are, we're also infinite beings. And it's hard to face that directly. Basically, we resist the hero's journey because it's overwhelming to perceive what we really are, and hence very daunting to live toward it. So I'd say that the, what are we up to, seventh reason why our world needs the hero archetype has to do with how it can draw us toward feeling the living heart of our existence itself. How it can teach us how it can teach us to hear its pulse, to bear witness to its resplendent beauty, to feel its warm caress passing over our trembling flesh, especially so that we might one day learn to live in accordance with the depth of our human nature. And that brings us to what I'd say would be the 8th reason why our world needs the hero archetype. And it has to do with the fact that our world is sick. And not sick in a good way, like really sick, dude. Usually in my videos, I talk about that in terms of our addiction to our own self-importance, which usually leaves us in a state of spiritual debilitation, I'd say. And as a product of that malaise, I'd say that the main template for our lives that our world is offering us is very truncated and not at all commensurate with the nature of our souls. Instead of teaching us to aspire to something like heroism, our world very often panders to our childish desires to be weak and incapable and dependent, constantly complaining whenever we feel the least bit discomfited or oppressed. In other words, I'd say that our world is teaching us a very unheroic way of dealing with life's demands. And it goes something like this. Step 1. Make lots of excuses for ourselves. Step 2. Shift blame onto other people and/or onto systemic conditions in our world more generally. Step 3. Bellyache about how life is unfair and unjust. Step 4. Blather on about how much the world owes us and how it needs to pay up. And finally, Step 5. Issue lots of strident demands about how everything needs to change in order to cater to our own preferences and to our own agendas. But the question is, does all of that really seem like a heroic attitude toward life? Does it sound like the language of courageous souls tempered by the fire of real adversity? Or does it sound more like the prattle of people hopelessly addicted to their own self-importance and who are desperately trying to avoid having to assume responsibility for themselves, mostly by concocting a whole lot of excuses and evasions? Basically, a page right out of Addictions 101. Well, personally, I'd say it's mostly the latter. But then again, I'd also say that in a way that makes sense since we live in addictive times. But of course, that doesn't mean that it's anyone's better destiny in this life. And so I'd say that the 8th reason why our world needs the hero archetype has to do with how it can serve as a corrective to the cheap, counterfeit template for our lives that our world is constantly trying to foist upon us. One that's mostly about feeding our addiction to our own self-importance at the expense of whatever heroism we might otherwise develop. Boom. Okay, and so there they are. 8 reasons why our world needs the hero archetype. So let's take a minute to summarize them. Number 1. The hero archetype offers us a much more elevated way of seeing life, a deeper set of values, and ultimately a better paradigm for our lives. Number 2, the hero archetype teaches us to honor our suffering as something worthwhile, as a necessary passage, and as something with a positive constructive potential for our lives. Number 3, the hero archetype can help us recover a more realistic sense for what heroism even is in the first place, and at the same time help us reclaim a correspondingly more realistic sense for our own heroic possibilities in life. Number 4, right? Number 4. The hero archetype can also help us become aware of how we actively resist heroism, which in turn can help us become free enough in life to decide to do otherwise. Number 5. The hero archetype calls us toward assuming adult responsibility for ourselves and for the quality of our lives. And it helps us become strong enough to carry the weight of that responsibility too. Number 6. The hero archetype teaches us to be more authentic. That is, to be who and what we really are, and to live toward what we possibly can be in this world, and not remain the obedient slaves of other people's desires and expectations. Number 7, the hero archetype can draw us toward feeling the living heart of existence itself, perhaps most especially so that we might one day learn to live in accordance with the depth of our human nature. God forbid. And finally, drum roll please, number 8. The hero archetype also serves as a corrective to the cheap counterfeit template for our lives that our world is constantly trying to foist upon us. One that's mostly about feeding our addiction to our own self-importance at the expense of whatever heroism we might otherwise embody. And so, what does all that add up to? Well, if, as Webster suggests, heroism has in part to do with the mythological and legendary figures of antiquity, like we said earlier, then I'd say that these days the hero archetype involves reclaiming some of the wisdom of the ancient world, rather than summarily dismissing it as worthless or irrelevant to our lives. After all, those myths and legends have managed to endure for millennia for a reason. And the reason is that through those long years, they've expressed something important about our human condition. And it would be extremely foolish on our part to reject it out of hand, or to let it wither on the vine from neglect. And anyhow, the fact is that it does seem like our world could use a little bit more wisdom. Or better yet, a lot more, no matter how antiquated its source may seem. And so I feel like our world really does need the hero archetype, perhaps now more than ever. And so, to me, the only real question is whether we can open the portals of our consciousness wide enough to receive it. But on the other hand, it seems like the jury's still out on that question. So, I guess on that uncertain note, thanks as always for taking the time to listen. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your attention. And, of course, as always, take care of your soul.